African economies are growing this year, but they still lag compared to developed countries. How can Sub-Saharan Africa close the inequality gap? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. A report just released from the International Monetary Fund indicates that sub-Saharan African economies are expected to grow 3.7% this year and 3.8% next year. The region is dealing with trade issues, inflation and supply chain delays. We will discuss the challenges facing the continent with a panel of analysts. But first, I spoke with the IMF Director of the Africa Department, Abebe Aemro Selassie, and I began by asking him about the impact of this growth gap between the region and developed countries.
Unfortunately, what it means in the near term is that, we are going to see a persistent gap rather than, this gap closing. What we're going to see is a gap of around 5% by 2024, unless things change dramatically. And really, there are two reasons why sub-Saharan African countries' recovery is slower than elsewhere in the world. I think the first one is there continues to be quite a bit of uncertainty, economic uncertainty in particular, because countries have not had as much access to vaccines as advanced countries and increasingly most emerging markets now. The level of vaccination in the region remains the same. So, and really largely for reasons beyond the control of countries, because vaccines are being hoarded by advanced countries, emerging market countries. They're the ones that have had first access to it. So I think making sure that there is much more improved access to vaccines, and once countries have them, people are vaccinated, is going to be important to put this pandemic behind us and look forward to an economic recovery. Second reason why activity remains has not rebounded as much as in advanced countries is the limited fiscal space, the limited financing space that countries have had to deal with this very severe shock that they've faced.
Right. The headline number, 3.7% for this year, is an average of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but I presume there are differences from one country to another. Do you see some countries doing a lot better than others?
Very much. I mean, the sub-Saharan Africa is around 45 countries and, very, very varied economic structures, economic size. So there's always quite a lot of variation. Just to give you an example, I mean, commodity exporters were hit particularly badly last year. This reflects the fact that they rely on a narrow set of commodities. They have a very narrow economic base, and of course last year commodity prices tanked. There was all kinds of dislocation to production also. So commodity exporting countries are only going to expand by around 2% this year. By contrast, countries with more varied economic structures will grow, over 4% this year. These economies, by virtue of the fact that they had more diverse economic structure, were able to weather the shock a bit better than their other brethren. So there is, as always, quite a bit of variation, and 3.7, as you said, represents an average.
Well, let's take a closer look at the situation right now. And, unfortunately, it's not a pretty picture if we look at this. 30 million people have been thrown into extreme poverty, incomes have dropped, and inflation is again on the rise. To what extent has the pandemic, and you talked about the pandemic a moment ago, to what extent has it wiped out the gains that have been made in alleviating poverty and improving things like health services and maintaining food security?
So, it's the multiplicity of shocks that is creating this difficulty. First and foremost, the pandemic itself, so far, except South Africa, some of its neighboring countries, in terms of actual infection levels, has been contained. What worries us with respect to the pandemic and its potential, health, it's all, the toll it has exacted already, and potential health toll is that, we've had 3 waves, more or less, in each country in the region, and each wave has been higher and higher, which is why kind of, our first priority, the first priority we think is vaccinating people to avoid a fourth wave, one as bad as we've seen elsewhere. So, so that's one saving grace, if you will, in terms of the direct hit of the pandemic. Now, beyond this, what we're seeing as the world is emerging from the pandemic is that there are pressures emerging on supply chains, but also, all labor markets and other areas. And what that's causing is quite a bit of dislocation to economies. In our region, how that's manifesting itself is in two ways in particular, in terms of harming standards of living. First, food prices, as you noted, something we highlight also, are increasing quite a bit, reflecting again disruption to global trade, but also domestically, as last year as economies were shut down, which will have had a bearing on distribution channels and the like. So that is a source of quite a bit of concern. And also, higher fuel prices also mean for the vast majority of countries in the region, which are fuel importers, also means that there is going to be pressure on prices going up and cascading through the economy, again, potentially squeezing incomes. So these are all sources of concern.
Well, let's look at some of the efforts that are being made to address the pandemic situation in Sub-Saharan Africa. The IMF goal is to vaccinate 40% of the total Sub-Saharan population by the end of 2021 and 70% by the end of 2022. Realistically, do you have any confidence that those targets will be met? Because one of the big problems we have seen with pharmaceutical companies that produce these vaccines is that they are not prepared right now to license manufacturing of these vaccines to other countries, which would be helpful in Africa.
Look, I mean, I think we're very, very proud that, Gita Gopinath and Ruchir Agarwal, colleagues of mine, were among the first to put out a global plan to vaccinate everybody in the world earlier in the summer. And I think, we have tried to set the agenda to push that it's unacceptable that you have a region as important, as populous as Africa being left behind in the vaccination race. That's why we came up with these targets, and we think they are very much achievable targets, But they can only be achieved if there is global cooperation, global coordination. So again, we would reiterate that, of course, the closer you get to these dates and action is not taken, the chances of it happening are lower. But, we do think that if you look at global supply of vaccines, these targets are achievable, but it requires, countries that are ahead in the queue to get vaccines to share their place in the queue to our countries. Also, though, once we get the vaccines, we also have to come up with very robust distribution, vaccination campaigns, so that they end up in shots in the arms rather than just in stores. So all of that has to fall in place, and I think if there is goodwill, if there is cooperation, it should happen. It can happen.
All right, I want to talk about trade, international trade, particularly China's trade relationship with Sub-Saharan Africa. It has grown, Chinese trade with Sub-Saharan Africa, in the past 2 decades, but there is still an imbalance that China would like to address. Are you hopeful that Sub-Saharan African countries will be able to move away from being commodities producing countries more into manufacturing countries that could export?
I think first, indeed, China is, of course, Africa's most important single trading partner. And this is, both the trade and financial linkages have deepened extensively. And China, beyond this trade and financial linkage, also is a very, very important development model for many countries in terms of how quickly development progress can be made from, in developing countries. So it's an inspiration also for our countries. And indeed, I mean, I do think that China and Africa's, global development trajectories, economic progress possibilities are interlinked, as, really is the case with many other parts of the world. First and foremost, I think, Africa and China are on different demographic trajectories. By 2030, 1 out of every 2 new entrants into the global labor market will be coming from Sub-Saharan Africa. This at a time in China, in Europe, and many other parts of the world, working age population will be declining. Second, I think, as always in the past, as China moves up the technology ladder, more low skill, more manufacturing type activities should migrate to Africa. Yeah. Where there is a lot of labor supply, as I just indicated. So I think the interplay between how fast population is aging in China, but also how quickly China's moving up the technology ladder, will have a big bearing on how quickly Africa is going to be able to diversify its economy and also create jobs that we need for our people.
Abebe Aemro Selassie, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
To continue our discussion, let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Abdullahi Boru Halakhe is an Africa security and policy analyst. Adetunji Omotola is also an Africa analyst. He is in Johannesburg, South Africa. And from Kampala, Uganda, Joseph Ochieno is a writer and commentator on African affairs. Welcome to all of you. Abdullahi, let me start with you. As we just heard, the countries of Sub-Saharan Africa will see GDP growth of 3.7% this year, 3.8% next year. That, of course, is a positive development. It's a good sign, but it will still fall short of growth that will be seen in developed countries, which in turn will, of course, lead to a widening of the inequality gap. What can the countries of Sub-Saharan Africa do to close that gap?
Thank you so much. I think since the debt cancellation of early 2000, which started in 1996, and 33 of 37 countries that qualified for that, I think while on the African continent, Somalia and Sudan and probably even Eritrea is under consideration. Somalia has qualified and its debt was cancelled last year. I think one of the critical things that African countries need to wrestle with is the micro and macro level fiscal stability that they need to begin engaging in. But if you look across the continent, I think the level of debt as a percentage of GDP is incredibly high, which leaves close to nothing in terms of headroom for them to be able to do much. And I think that is where a lot of effort needs to be concentrated. But I think, let's be honest, some of these countries were heading into the wrong direction economically speaking, even before COVID hit, and COVID has really hammered most of these countries, including the third and potentially the fourth wave.
So as you say, debt levels, Abdullahi, are very high, unsustainable. How do they get out of that hole?
I think that is the hardest question. And I think you've realized even for most of these countries, deferring the payment of the debt hasn't done much because they are in such a difficult condition, and some of them they hugely rely on natural resources, particularly oil and gas. And just to give you a few examples, Nigeria's production has gone down, so has the price of oil globally. You see with Mozambique, the region in Cabo Delgado, where we are having a conflict with a militant group, is the region where the government's invested enough amount in terms of the offshore oil drilling, and as well as Angola. So there are no easy answers. Some of the things that we are seeing is IMF mostly, and World Bank included, moving into these countries and pushing them into austerity measures. That means selling off some of non-performing state institutions, retrenchment of civil servants. But the problem is that model that was the IMF and World Bank has advised most of these countries has not done much. If anything, it has made the situation much difficult. I think there are very, very difficult times ahead for most of the central bank and the ministers for finances in most of the African countries. I wouldn't be surprised if a different format of debt cancellation is not started both at IMF, World Bank, and the UN. But even then, it will face some challenges because some of these debt are from, they are not mostly from the traditional institutions that we are used, some including China and some including private banks. So I think they are really difficult questions and difficult road ahead.
Joseph, let's look at the impact that COVID-19 has had on the economies of Sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, COVID has hit the entire world, but let's look specifically at this region. What is your assessment of the impact COVID has had on growth?
It's been extraordinary, and thanks for having me. Really, Africa was possibly the least ready continent in the entire world, as you can imagine. Our health services are very poor. It was perhaps a bit of a wake-up call to African governments that they need to invest not only generally in a broader infrastructure that includes health, but perhaps investment in health. It's interesting that as I was preparing for this program, I just noticed that Africa's dependency on pharmaceutical needs is nearly 100%. That is extremely scary. So that tells you really how bad we are as far as COVID is concerned. But I mean, that said, I totally agree that I think the road ahead is very, very difficult. And I also agree that while African governments may have to review their spending and investment models, who are going to be rescuing the continent? I just don't believe it's going to be IMF and World Bank. I was part of the Jubilee campaign in the 2000s as referred, but for me it was very much about not debt cancellation, but actually debt destruction, because IMF and World Bank lent rather recklessly. And if only 20 years ago there were debt cancellations, how does it happen that in the last only 20 years we managed to accumulate this huge amount of debt?
Adetunji, African countries are dependent on natural resource exports, especially oil and minerals. And we know that global demand for these commodities have dropped. And we add to that now, as we've just been discussing, the impact of COVID and, of course, the reduction in tourism that has brought about. There's also been a reduction in foreign remittances from African workers. It's pushed 40 million Africans into extreme poverty. How big a challenge will that be for African countries just to get those 40 million people out of poverty?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Look, I think that when you talk about, first of all, let's look at a country like Nigeria. Whilst Nigeria has been dominated by oil, the biggest problem for Nigeria is its failure to diversify the economy. If you recall that about 7 years ago, the Nigerian Minister for Agriculture, who is now the president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Ochieno, he was very successful. He was Forbes Person of the Year in 2013. And why was he Forbes Person of the Year? Because he was able to work very hard to begin to help local farmers to grow food in Nigeria to be able to sustain that large population. And I must say to you that today, Nigeria does not import as much as it used to. So the focus should be for many of these countries in Africa, especially countries that have a very youthful population, to get those young people to go to the farm and start farming. And I'm sure you would also have seen the rise of techies, tech companies that are doing very well in Kenya, in Nigeria, in South Africa. There's a lot of money that is coming. There's a particular company that has just been valued at about $3 billion, Flutterwave. These companies are really doing a lot in terms of payments. These are non-oil companies. Mm-hmm. Of course, the telcos are also driving. I mean, you saw the round in Ethiopia. I believe that it was to do with Safaricom and Vodacom Group, where they paid almost $1 billion for a license fee. So there's a lot of opportunity. And of course, the elephant in the room that people are talking about now is the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which will increase the GDP of Africa to well over $3 trillion. The challenge for that, though, is that some countries are still protecting their markets and they don't want to open up. And also the fact that there's little infrastructure in most parts of Africa. I mean, the big markets like Aba, Onitsha, and so on, they're congested. There's no infrastructure. So if these countries can really focus on, trading amongst one another, especially where they have competitive advantage, link Aba to Johannesburg, link Nairobi to Aba. There will be a lot of opportunity, and we can reduce we can increase the opportunities that we're currently lacking on the continent.
Abdullahi, the other big challenge for the countries of Africa will be climate change. In fact, we are seeing the effects of climate change already. What is your assessment of the impact that it is having right now, and of course, the money that it would cost to mitigate these effects?
Thank you so much. I think that is one really important point, that if African countries are not going to address them, they are going to be disproportionately impacted. Just to give you a sense, the Horn of Africa, starting from Djibouti, Somalia, and southern Ethiopia, northern Kenya, northwest Kenya, you go all the way to the Sahel belt via Chad. These are largely areas where the climatic condition is, even in the best of times, not really good. As a result, most of the people in this region are largely reliant on pastoral economy, which is a multi-billion economy, but an economy that is largely reliant on a regular rainfall season. And over the last few years, at least in the Horn of Africa region, the frequency of the drought has exponentially increased. It used to be probably 4 to 5 years. Now that has reduced to 2 to 3 years. What that means, not just for food production, but even for livelihood, that is tremendous. But again, we cannot talk about impact of climate change and how to mitigate its impact without necessarily thinking about equity. If you look at the contribution towards, the emissions, African countries are at the bottom of the barrel. But when it comes to the impact on how they'll be affected, they are at the sharp end of the tunnel. At the sharp end of the spear. And that, I think, it requires an international solidarity that is anchored in equity, rather than saying we are transitioning into green, clean energy. And if anything, a place like Kenya and the countries in the region, they get a huge chunk of their electricity, in fact, from hydro as well as solar energy. They are doing their part. But then again, climate change, like with many other global problems, it's a global commons problem that even if you live and eat healthy, even if as a country you go green, its impact will be with you. And I think as we head to COP 26, I think African countries need to advocate and move in a very robust way in trying to call to attention to this. They do it in their own little ways. Most of them have got clean and green energy policies, but it will not do much. It will just be a drop in the ocean.
Right. In fact, you're right. The African countries are least responsible for the climate conditions that we see right now, but they are feeling the biggest impact. Joseph, talking about the impact, a recent UN report showed a 40% increase in people being affected by food security in 2020 compared to 2019. Can you give us a sense of how big a challenge this will be on the continent?
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because that is to 2020, and that was discounting the center of COVID, as you've just suggested. So it should really be worse today. There is a huge opportunity, though, for Africa, if only there were clear leadership and very deliberate and reinvestment in agriculture. A country like Nigeria could possibly do very well by boosting its agricultural investments and inputs. So the rest of the major African economies, including perhaps my native Uganda, Ethiopia, the countries with very huge amount of land. By the way, we can go to the list of these nations called the new nation South Sudan. Huge agricultural land, but perhaps substantial incapacity by both the government and perhaps the cultural setup of the country to be able to turn it around so that it becomes much less dependent. So I think there is need for a deliberate policy programs by governments in Africa to focus on the best niche. Talking about this, so we're talking about, for example, Kenya, other than agriculture, they're contained. Perhaps once COVID is away, tourism will flourish and they will do well. What about the rest of the other continent? I think Southern Africa, Zambia, you can talk about. Zimbabwe, you can talk about. I think if we looked inward, and I totally concur that if we looked at the African continental free trade area as part of those options, there is no reason why there cannot be hope over the next 5 or so years. And beyond that, actually, if you look at, again, the bigger economies, petroleum, mining, and really, mainly petroleum and mining, and natural gas and natural resources. These are things which are in there. Once COVID settles, you expect the population to want to work. There's no reason why we don't have a quicker turnaround generally. I just hope that as the broader world economy grows and rebounds, if you like, countries again like Nigeria, Kenya, and to an extent Ethiopia, who also depend substantially on remittances from abroad, will, in this case, try to make the best use of it. But in Nigeria's case, perhaps they need to look at some of their tariff reforms and forex.
Adetunji, you were telling us a moment ago about the failure of many African countries to adequately diversify their economies. And I'm wondering if there is an opportunity right now when we look at the African continent's relationship with China. China has just adopted a new domestic strategy, which it calls dual circulation, which is going to emphasize more domestic consumption in China. And I'm wondering, to what extent will this provide opportunities for African entrepreneurs and African manufacturing enterprises?
Yes, I think, look, the critical factor, first of all, that worries me personally is that we tend to forget what we have and look for what we don't have. So if you want to use the case of Nigeria, which is always a good case to use, if Nigeria has 36 states, and out of those 36 states, only about 4 or 5 states are viable. And most of those states that are viable are the oil-producing states who raise revenue from the federal allocation. When you look at the IGR compared to the federal allocation, you see that those states are not doing well in terms of internally generated revenue. Now, so you find all these governors, 36 of them, most of them are running to Abuja every month to get the federal allocation. Now, if you look at China, China is over 1 billion people. Even India is over 1 billion people. There's so many natural products that Nigeria has got. Shea butter, we've got sorghum, we've got, in fact, I'll give you an example. The cashew nuts that is produced in Nigeria for the Western markets is not value added enough for them to go straight into the Western markets, like the US. So they have to take it to Vietnam to go and reprocess it before they then take it to the US. And so this is, so even if it's China, it's still going to be the same problem. So until we can value add, until African markets can value add their products, whether it's cocoa, whether it's cotton, whatever it is, if we cannot raise the standard to international global standards, it doesn't matter whether you diversify your economy, you're not going to get market access. And that is why you see a lot of countries, they just leave their products or they sell it raw in volume, and they're not getting much for it. But I think, here's the thing, I think one big market that can be looked at from an African perspective, and which is happening already. I mean, I'm based in South Africa, and because of COVID, there's been a deluge of African restaurants, at least 9 out of 10 African restaurants that pop up, they're Nigerian restaurants. And why is that? Because the only thing that was not, during lockdown, the only activity that was not stopped was gas and food. People still had to go to the shops to go and get food because you got to eat for sustenance. And so in fact, there was a minister in Nigeria about 7 years ago, the Minister for Trade and Investment, he came up with something called the Nigerian Diaspora Investment Scheme or something like that, export scheme, which is to take products from Nigeria that are made in Nigeria and send it to Nigerians in diaspora. I think that's a market that can be tapped into, whether it's Kenya, whether it's South Africa. There are more Nigerians or more Kenyans now moving into diaspora, and they still want the same products that they used to having when they were home. I think that's a real opportunity.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Arnold Gnaidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.